step into the realm of daring ideas and transformative dialogues. This is Voices from the Edge, the podcast that pushes boundaries and ventures beyond the ordinary. Here, we confront the crucial issues that shape our world today. From the heartbeat of community challenges to the untold chronicles of leadership. From the relentless pursuit of social justice to the essential lessons in safety and lifelong learning. Voices from the Edge takes you to the crossroads of change. Because the edge is not just a boundary, it's where growth happens. It's where the real conversations begin. So lean in, be inspired, and let's explore what lies beyond the edge.
And joining us today is the marvellous John Cherrie. John, how are you?
I'm very well. Nice to meet you, Tom.
Professor John Cherrie graduated in physics from Edinburgh University and went to work at the Institute of Occupational Medicine. His early career involved measuring exposure to airborne fibres, both asbestos and man-made mineral fibres. The latter work was in support of a large European epidemiology study coordinated by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. John developed an interest in occupational hygiene and the science behind occupational exposure to harmful agents. In 1991, he joined the University of Aberdeen to set up a master's course in occupational hygiene. During this time, John developed his interest in retrospective occupational exposure assessment for epidemiological studies, and this work formed the basis of his PhD, which he received in 1996. In 2003, John rejoined the IOM and took on the role of research director. During this time, he broadened the research interest to encompass the exposome, human exposure assessment, occupational cancer, environmental and occupational epidemiology, natural and synthetic fibers, dermal exposure, and air pollution. In 2015, John took up the chair in human health at Heriot Watt University. John is a retired chartered fellow of the faculty of the British Occupational Hygiene Society.
Hello. Beautiful. And John, you're joining us from lovely Scotland. What's the weather like in Scotland at the moment?
Well, it's summer here, so it's been pretty good in the last few days, although I woke up to fairly torrential rain this morning. That's fairly typical of the UK. You know, the weather just is constantly changing.
Yeah, we woke up to, hard to believe in wonderful Perth, we woke up to torrential rain too, but it was gone by about 8 o'clock. So, beautiful winter's day over here.
Good.
All right. Now, John, brought you on because of your stellar career in epidemiology, but we're here today to talk primarily about asbestos. Now, asbestos in Australia was banned from being imported, exported and used predominantly since 2003. And earlier on, through the 90s, we started phasing it out, but still manages to be a problem. So let's start with some of the things you've found with asbestos. What do you think is the most persistent myths or workplace myths or industrial myths that you keep hearing about asbestos even to this day?
Well, I think one of the issues is people are kind of trapped in the past in terms of asbestos. They've heard all these stories about, the bad days when asbestos was being used to install insulation in houses and public buildings and so on. And they realized that at that time, regulations were very poor and people were exposed to very high concentrations. But back in the 1980s, the organization that I worked for then, the Institute of Occupational Medicine, we carried out a study measuring the exposure of workers installing asbestos. And we got concentrations up to 400 fibres per milliliter. And typical fibres were in the sort of 100 fibres per milliliter. So, really, even at that stage, things were pretty bad. And somehow people have got trapped in that mentality and thinking that that's what the situation's like today. But actually, certainly in the UK, Things are very, very different, and exposures for workers nowadays are very low.
Well, that's good. That's good. And I saw some of your research earlier because it was there was some thoughts that redeveloping sites where asbestos had been buried in the ground or basically needed to be removed, that there was still a huge and significant risk to workers, and that's perhaps not the case anymore.
I mean, it's very difficult for us in the UK, certainly, to say much about that because we haven't got published exposure data for people who are working on contaminated land sites. In theory, you would expect that if the soil's dry and it contains asbestos, that the concentration that's generated in handling that soil will reflect the contamination. So the higher level of contamination, the greater the exposure. But if it's not really in the percent levels, then the level of exposure is likely to be fairly low. And again, in the UK, we have this thing that damps everything down called rain. And when it rains, you really don't get very much exposure at all.
Absolutely. What are some of the most unexpected or unusual sources of asbestos exposure that have caught people off guard, in the past?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in buildings, one of the biggest problems we have is that asbestos was so useful in the past. So we would try and incorporate it in lots of situations where you perhaps wanted good thermal insulation, or you wanted to give that piece of cement some structural integrity, or you needed to seal, joints and so on. So asbestos was used in all these sorts of situations. So nowadays, if you go into a building that was in the UK built before about 1980, 1990, then there's a chance to find asbestos almost everywhere. And it's not just public buildings, but domestic properties as well. But really, if you want some exotic uses of asbestos, people were very creative at the very first years, and the turn of the last century, people were using asbestos to make things like baby incubators because it gave better thermal insulation. And they were using asbestos to make complete houses, everything in the house made from asbestos, because it was a big selling point because it reduced your insurance for fire damage. So, we were very creative in our uses of asbestos. And that's, I think, one of the legacies problems that we have is that you can find it almost anywhere.
Yeah, I did some reading, and I believe at its peak there was a bit over 3,000 different building products that used asbestos as part of its making.
Yeah.
I know for certain that I've been in places where they've got asbestos sheeting on the walls. They've got asbestos. What do you call it? Ceilings. They've also got asbestos. Some of the older places I've seen have still got the asbestos roofing on the outside.
Yeah.
We still have building fences in Australia occasionally that are still made out of asbestos. It seems prevalent, and some of the scary things I think is seeing it still in older public schools. Not so much because of the material, because when it's bonded and it hasn't been damaged, there's not much danger. But then, of course, we have the people who come in and drill and cut and sand and do all those wonderful things which releases the fibres.
Yeah, and I think in the UK we estimate that something like about 80% of our schools have asbestos somewhere in the school estates. And actually, I'll maybe take issue with you a little bit, Tom. You were saying that as long as it's not disturbed, it's not a problem. But I actually think that's not the case nowadays. I think that asbestos will be a problem regardless, because we've really done so much to reduce the exposure that people have that the problem is not now with the workers, but it's the people who are incidentally exposed, almost exposed for no particular reason, but just because the asbestos is in the building. And I've been doing some calculations recently to try and see who is it that we should be concerned about going forward in terms of future risks for mesothelioma. And it's really just those people who are in offices, schools, other buildings where there might be very slight releases of asbestos. And because there are so many people, maybe even, 15 million people in the UK who are exposed like that, because the numbers are so large, then the potential impact in terms of number of cases of disease in the future is potentially very big.
Yeah, yeah. Just for those who aren't fully familiar with asbestos, and as we spoke off air, I find a whole generation of people coming through who have never really dealt with some of the risks of asbestos, and it's considered to be yesterday's problem and not today's. Why is asbestos so dangerous?
So asbestos is a natural mineral fiber. So when you look at it under the microscope, what you can see are these long needle-like structures or long floating sort of fiber-like structures. And they are very robust. That's, as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the reasons why we used them originally in products. So that means that and when they get disturbed, they're small enough so that they can get suspended in the air and we can inhale them into our lungs. Now, the human body is very adapted to dealing with dusts that it inhales. So, because we've evolved as beings to try to mitigate as much of the exposure that we get like that. But these fibers are quite unusual dust because they're very long and very thin, and the body's defense systems are very poor at dealing with them. They can't really deal with such a big, elongated particle. So because they're very biopersistent, in other words, they stay in the lung for a long time, and they have this unusual shape, the lung defenses just keep constantly trying to deal with them and failing. And it's that almost like an irritation effect that creates a series of damage entities in the lungs, and that can cause lung cancer. It can cause mesothelioma, which is the cancer of the lining of the lung or the gut, which is so well associated with asbestos, and can cause other diseases like asbestosis, which is a scarring of the lung, like black lung that coal miners get.
Yeah, yeah. And it's considered to have a long lag time from exposure to when symptoms, or at least that's what I've heard, long lag time from when exposure occurs to when symptoms start presenting themselves. Is that still considered correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I think on average, the lag time for mesothelioma is about 40 years. So if you were exposed in 2000, then the people who were exposed then, the time that they might start to get, or the time where the peak of mesothelioma occurring might be 40 years after that, 2040. And it's not like everybody has to wait that time, but it's less than 15 years is almost unheard of, and it can then range up to be well beyond 40 years, 60, 70 more years. So it's a very uncertain thing, but a long delay between first exposure and disease being apparent.
Yeah. Is it possible with that length of lag time after exposure that in the past we may have misdiagnosed a significant number of, I don't know, I guess I don't want to say victims, but people who have died of asbestos-related disease because of that?
I think the terminology victims is okay to use, Tom. I mean, I think they have suffered from something that they was inflicted on them. Is there a chance that people were misdiagnosed? I think 50, 60 years ago maybe, but nowadays I don't think that's true. I think that the fact that the tumour is quite distinctive in terms of its location and its biochemistry and so on is such that it's almost unheard of, I think, to have misdiagnosed. At least in Australia and the UK and other countries where there's the infrastructure to do that.
Yeah. You were talking earlier about the main people who will be affected by asbestos now, at least in modern countries where they've put in place effective control measures, are the people who are incidentally living with it or working in environments where it's exposed. Has it been, at least in your opinion, rather successfully controlled by people like working in the building industry?
I think so. I mean, we have certainly here we have pretty poor intelligence about that, but all the information that's available to us, both the published scientific information and the information from the regulator, suggests that almost all contractors handling asbestos are well aware of the problems and that they take the appropriate precautions to protect their workers and to protect, as far as they can, people around about. So yeah, I think we've done a great job. The Health and Safety Executive, which is the regulator in the UK, recently carried out some studies where they investigated quite intensively 8 sites where they were removing asbestos materials. And the highest exposure that they measured was around about 1 fibre per milliliter. And the typical values were all less than about a tenth of that. So, and that's for the workers. And of course, they're not exposed to those levels because they're wearing highly effective respiratory protection. So they get the benefits of better control measures in use, but also better protection for themselves with respirators.
Good. Have you seen anything new on the horizon in terms of effective control measures that's a little bit different than what we're currently using?
I think there's a reluctance, in my opinion anyway, there's a reluctance in the removal industry to kind of champion new ideas. And part of that, I think, is because they know that with the existing techniques, they can comply with the current legislation. But in the UK, we're busy considering how we might take forward exposure limits for asbestos in the future. Currently, we have a limit of 0.1 fibres per milliliter. But in Europe, they've gone down to a tenth of that value, so 0.01 fibres per milliliter. And they intend to go even lower if they can. Now, I don't think reducing the limit value will do much to protect the workers doing the work. But what it will do is it will force the contractors to think about new ways of doing the work. Because the way, I don't know if you and your listeners are aware of how respirators are assigned, but basically in the UK, we say if you use a full face respirator with a positive pressure system, then you can assume that it will take the exposure down by a factor of 40 compared to what you would inhale otherwise. Now, that's fine if the sort of concentrations are, as I said, about say typically 1 fibre per mil, and the target you're trying to get to is below 0.1, because a factor of 40 is well below that. So, but the problem is, if we would drop that limit from 0.1 to 0.01, then the respirator is no longer going to be sufficient to actually protect the workers adequately. So you're going to have to do something upstream to change the methodologies. Now, it's not my particular expertise, but I think doing more to encapsulate or enclose the materials that you're trying to remove, and using better localized ventilation are two techniques that I think have a lot of merit to explore.
Very good, very good. All right. Now, as we spoke off air, I'm hearing still reports from builders today that despite the fact we banned import of products containing asbestos in Australia in 2003, that certain building products are being imported, I don't know, from, let's say, other less regulated countries, who, with their labelling system, have said if it's below a certain percentage of asbestos containment in the materials, they consider it asbestos free. How do you think we go about tackling the different countries' standards and materials which are obviously being brought in, which are still containing asbestos, in order to protect both the workers and the people who work in those environments?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult because there's no checks really on products coming into, well, certainly in the UK, nobody's checking products to make sure that they don't contain asbestos. And so you have to rely on the purchaser to do their due diligence and investigate. Now, if you're not aware that this is a potential problem, then naively you might just accept it. And I think as I say, I think that is an issue. People need to be aware that you have to do that due diligence, check out what the products are, and make sure that they're appropriately constructed. I know in my own experience that in developing countries there can be still a big impetus to use asbestos. A lot of countries are not like Australia and the UK. They still use asbestos, and so there's not the same sensitivity in these situations to, oh, it's asbestos, we really need to be very careful. It's just another product that's being used, and I think it can be a very difficult thing. To be fair, I've not heard of any situations in the UK where we have imported materials that have subsequently been shown to contain asbestos, but I'm sure it's a possibility.
Yeah.
I'll just digress for a little bit, if that's okay, Tom.
Yeah.
Back in the 1980s, we were doing a lot of work in our labs for different countries, and we would get samples from all over the world coming into the lab for testing. And we got a phone call one day from the customs in Glasgow saying, "We just received a package from Colombia for you, and it's got this white powder inside it. What should we think about this?" And the first thing we said was, "Well, don't open the packet. It's not what you think it might be." So
Yeah.
sometimes customs are on call, but they're probably looking for other things.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. One of the emerging threats, I guess it's emerging. I mean, we've known about it for, I think, quite a long time, but it's emerging insofar as exposure and public awareness, is another airborne disease called, it's silica, and its creation of silicosis. Now, thinking about the way we managed asbestos and public awareness and regulatory campaigns to eventually remove the use of asbestos in building materials, is there any lessons that those who are designing a framework around the use and, basically the use of silicon-based products could learn?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the history with asbestos, we knew that it was harmful for a very long time before we eventually banned it. And I think that actually is a pattern that you see over and over with hazardous materials, that we're aware of the issues long before we actually take action. And I suppose the biggest lesson I would say we could learn from asbestos is don't wait. Take action sooner rather than later. And there are lots of ways to control hazards, but if it's a severe hazard and it's going to potentially put a lot of people at risk, then the most effective way to deal with that is to ban it. And as I understand it, these materials, the artificial stone materials that are being sold for manufacturing kitchens and other situations, they don't need to contain the silica. It's not necessary. It's just cheap and it produces a good product. But you could find an alternative. So what we've argued in the UK is that we should ban these materials and then, but not ban them immediately, ban them and give say a 2 or 3 year lag time, and give the industry time to adapt and change the products that it's selling, and that would, I think, be a very effective strategy.
Good. If I was to ask you what your feelings were about asbestos-related disease, are you optimistic that we are on the right track of basically making this a disease of a past in the next generation, or are you more of the thoughts that it'll stay with us literally forever?
I am confident that by 2060 or thereabouts in the UK, we will have got rid of most of the disease burden associated with asbestos. And it takes a long time, as you mentioned earlier in the chat, that there's a long latency time between people being exposed and the disease mesothelioma occurring. But I look around now and I look at the evidence we have for people being exposed today, and I can't see any situations where there's high exposure. So it's for that reason I think that we shouldn't expect that in the next 40 years that the number of cases of disease won't come down steadily over that time. We've actually already seen a change in the UK. So we've gone through the peak of the epidemic for mesothelioma, and it looks as though we're on the downward turn. So we're going in the right direction. The evidence for exposure suggests that things are pretty well controlled, and I'm fairly confident that that's the right track to be on.
Good. Lastly, on a personal note, curious, what initially drew you to working in the occupational health field, and what kept you basically passionate about it through the whole of your career?
I started working for the Institute of Occupational Medicine in 1979, and I originally trained at university as a physicist. And when I came out of university, I couldn't get a job in physics, and I ended up working as a computer programmer, and I found it the most boring job in the world. So I kept looking around, and I saw a job advertised at the Institute of Occupational Medicine, the place that I've worked mostly through my career, and I applied. And they wanted a physicist, but I was unsuccessful for that. And but then a fortnight later, I got a phone call from the guy who'd interviewed me, and he said, "I wonder if you'd be interested. We've got a job as a not a physicist, but as an occupational hygienist, and we need somebody who can program computers." So I got in more by chance than by good measure. So I mean, that's why I got started. I got involved in epidemiology. Then we were looking at synthetic mineral fibres, so the kind of glass wool, rock wool type products, and the potential health effects of them. And I just got intrigued by the problems involved. It was challenging work, it was intellectually stimulating work, and it was socially useful. And I think the combination of all those things are what's kept me interested all those years. The fact that personally I've got a lot of satisfaction in doing the work, but I can feel at the end of the day that I've done some good that will benefit some people in the world.
Yeah. John, on a personal note from me, thank you for all your years you've put into actually helping improve health conditions for society and workers in particular. So thank you very much. I would hate you to slide into retirement without getting thanked appropriately. But for now, we're going to have to leave it there. But I do look forward to
sorry, Tom. And thanks very much. It's been a great pleasure to meet you.
Thanks for listening to Voices from the Edge. If you like what we are doing, like the episode in the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss any future episodes and leave a positive review.